The fear of rejection becomes so overwhelming that we're like, no, demoing is a bad idea. And having tasted a little bit of career success, that gave me that fear. At some point I realized that's a much better attitude. I should embrace. Yeah, it's, I'm barreling towards some recording dates. So it's a little bit grindstony, but can't complain. And it's not out of control around here. So that I'm happy about. It's not like some super hard crunch going on. So it's all good. How about yourself?
Really good, man. I feel the same way. A bunch of projects, not a bunch, but 2 big projects I was working on for really all year long have come to a screeching halt. Now we have this holiday break and kind of getting back into the swing of things probably in, 6 weeks or so. So it's kind of a weird feeling to not be super busy, but I'm trying to use this as productive time and to really kind of stop and figure out what I'm going to be doing for this next year.
What brought them to a halt? Like, what did something intervene, or did they finish?
Well, one of them is a soundtrack for a game that just released, and then the next one, nice. We're doing phases of the soundtrack, and so we got through the first phase, and now the second one will be early 2021, which is super exciting. I'm not used to doing that, but it's really cool.
Meaning what exactly? Like, meaning they just kind of bring you on at sort of periodic intervals, or?
Well, for this game, it's really interesting because this is their first time doing a game, but they have a really large budget, and so they're going for full orchestra, or at least semi-orchestra, and they're building the game alongside the soundtrack, which is something I've never done for a game before. Because typically, as you know, we're like the last guys in. Not always, but there seems to be this experimental vibe going on that, I don't know. I think with these guys in particular, they're so inspired by music that they wanted to go ahead and have the music to use as they built the game. I'm not going to argue with them.
Yeah, I've worked that way before. I usually resist the urge to actually record the music early because what has happened in my experience in those cases, and I mean, Journey was made that way. They always led. I
was going to ask you about that, yeah.
But in my experience, yeah, they always, we make such revelations that even when they make the game in a sense around the music, you still find opportunities to improve it and revise. And I'm always grateful that I'm still dealing with mock-ups and I haven't committed to the final recordings yet, because it boxes you in unless their budget is just so much that they don't mind re-recording things, which is, I mean, that I've literally never had that. I've only ever, pickups is one thing, but going in knowing, this is all disposable. So yeah, I remember they wanted to do that on Assassin's Creed. They actually asked if I could go to London twice, and I told them no. I told them they would regret it because they were doing a public showcase of the game like 6 months before. They as their announcement of the game, they wanted like an hour playable to show to people. Wow. So it wasn't just a trailer. And I was like, I know it sucks, but I think we would be better served having that playable demo have mock-ups in it. And so that's what we did.
Man, how did that go with Journey though? So you're saying that you did mock-ups the entire time until the very end?
Yep. Oh yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, I always do that actually. I've almost never truly committed to a recording until the last second, simply because I'm often changing and revising and tweaking until the last second. And so I just would hate to have finished assets, because it happens all the time. I mean, it literally happened on this project I'm working on now, where I had a sudden kind of epiphany the other day that made me go and tweak some of the cues that have been approved and locked for like 6 months. So hypothetically could have recorded those, but I'm like, I just got an idea that will make those better because of something I discovered for like cues way elsewhere in the game.
I've never done that. That's very curious.
Yeah,
but I think that's some wisdom I might want to listen to.
I mean, I've known folks, the perfect counterexample, even though it's not orchestral, is my dear pal Darren Korb,
Yeah.
because they went so far as to fully produce and release as a succession of singles
Wow.
every
Yeah.
cue of the score. So Hades was in early access for like 2 years or something before it officially came out. And every month they released new music as a single on, and so the soundtrack album on Spotify is actually just a playlist of all these individually released singles. And so that's the hard opposite. I mean, they committed so fully that he literally packaged it, mastered it, and released it commercially before the game was even officially finished. So that's the diametric opposite of what I'm advocating. In his case, the thing that's obvious, that's unspoken about that, is if he needs to go back and change something, it's just on him to pick up his guitar and redo it. It's the whole other ballgame to get together an orchestra again.
Very interesting.
But even just philosophically, the idea of like, I've committed to this music even though the overall project is unfinished. That's very antithetical to the way I like to work, but to me, there's something interesting about it. Someday I'll probably want to try that just to see how it affects my thinking.
Yeah, well, ask me again in like 6 months and we'll see how successful this was.
Well, congrats on those gigs, man. That's great.
Yeah, I appreciate that, man. Well, I wanted to congratulate you that you are officially the last episode of the year for this show. And with that, just something I'd love to talk with other composers about is I would love to know, how has 2020 affected you from a business perspective, and what have you done to overcome that? Because you've stayed busy this whole year, it seems. Have you stopped long enough to even consider that? What has that been like for you, man?
I feel grateful to say that there's been nothing really to overcome. And I say that recognizing that puts me in a preciously rare category, but it's actually been in a way busier than ever. It's actually not truly busier than ever in the sense that it's not like I had this just record-shattering year of busyness, but I had, for all intents and purposes, no slowdown whatsoever. And this is just by the dumb luck that my career is so overwhelmingly based in video games, which is just about the most COVID-proof industry that there could be. I mean, it's, as I'm fond of saying, games is basically one big giant IT department. And if ever there were people equipped to have to suddenly shift to work from home and VPNs and all the kinds of strategies necessary to take, in some cases, companies like I was talking to my friend Marcin Shibowicz over at CD Projekt Red, who just shipped Cyberpunk, and he was saying that, inside of like 2 days, they had the entire 800-person team working from home in Poland and elsewhere around the world. And it's like that, not a lot of industries are capable of doing that. Even the only sort of close second might be animated film and TV. But even then, it's not going to be as easy a shift as in games, I think, just because there's still, like I have a friend who does visual effects for ILM and Weta Workshop and stuff, and it talks about, the specialized high-end 4K monitors that they work on. They get color calibrated every few days by people with very specialized equipment and stuff to make sure that they are seeing on screen an accurate representation of what it is. Like if they click red in their paintbrush, to use a simplified analogy, it's actually red. It's kind of like calibrating your room and making sure that you're hearing the low end the way it's being recorded, that sort of thing. So it's like things like that require some infrastructure, even for animation, which is still like basically people working at computers and not going on sets and things the way traditional filmmaking is. It's still a little bit more dependent on a facility of some kind and an infrastructure, although those things can be gotten around. But games, totally safe. So yeah, I, by and large, with some exceptions, I have an actor friend that does tremendous amounts of motion capture, for example, and he had to do some jobs where everything was traditionally animated and it was all voiceover, but would have been motion capture. So there are some sacrifices, but yeah, honestly, the only adjustment that I really had to make was that I've had a handful of recording sessions that I had to do remotely that I wouldn't have ideally done remotely. I would have flown, like I did some stuff in Nashville, and I would normally fly to Nashville and conduct it myself, but we did it remote. And we also had to wait. I was lucky, by dumb luck, my project's deadlines fell in this window where when we were at the very early stages and everything was at its most sort of draconian, like there's just nothing. We just don't really know what's going on right now. Fortunately, I didn't have a deadline land in the middle of that window. I had just finished a series of recordings in London, which I would have been totally screwed if I had had to do those a month later. So that was just dumb luck. And then I didn't need a big proper orchestra again for like maybe 2 months. And so that also was just luck. I have plenty of friends that didn't end up in that situation and had to rely on, armies of musicians all recording one by one at home in order to try to recreate an orchestra. And, that works better than you would think, but it's still not the same. And it's also just such a music editing tedium nightmare that fortunately, I didn't have to do any of that. So yeah, I feel insanely grateful. I like truly, truly grateful that it's been busy, and it's been everything seems to have worked out okay, and that the deadlines just decided to. I was sort of blessed by the deadline gods that my milestones just kind of corresponded to dips, and therefore, even though I was remote, these orchestras felt comfortable convening to record. And so we made it happen.
Yeah. Well, it seems to me that the core group here with this audience listening are game composers. And what's been really interesting that the conversation this year has really been a lot of film composers and TV composers and any other physical medium where people are meeting locally to do their work. A lot of those people are making a shift to the game industry for a lot of the reasons that you just said, that there's almost like this IT-proof, COVID-proof nature to it. So I'm curious, from your perspective as someone who actually lives in the heart of Los Angeles, how has that been with those industries? And do you see that there is this decline in the film industry that might not be able to recover?
Well, if you separate film and television as two separate entities, then I would say there's almost no question that film is undergoing a sort of epileptic shock right now. I mean, the fact that theaters are still basically not a revenue stream for film, which were relied upon for billions of dollars of revenue just 10 months ago or whatever, that they are still recovering from. I mean, look at what just happened with Warner Brothers' announcement of their entire slate being available on HBO Max. And even directors benefiting from that, like Denis Villeneuve with the new Dune film, saying, I did not make this film to be watched on a laptop at home. This is a theatrical film. I would rather wait. But I feel like Warner Brothers is looking at the writing on the wall going, I'm not so sure that that's a thing that we can wait for. If we don't start providing content, because meanwhile, look over at, Disney Plus just announced like what was it, like a $12 billion production slate or something? Like they're spending
crushing it. They're
20
taking over.
plus TV shows coming. And these are shows with a production value that do circles around most everything ever. I mean, the sheer production. And the crazy thing is when you look at Mandalorian as the case study, The Mandalorian has these outrageous production values, and the vast majority of it is done on a soundstage with the kind of next generation green screen tech, which is not actually green screen. It's
like a dome.
It's amazing. Yeah, kind of rethought the way they did green screen back in the early days of Hollywood, where you'd be in a car and they're projecting footage of a street behind the actor. So it's not a green screen. It's literally being projected in the room with them. Just that essentially that tech has gotten so good that isn't
that built in the Unreal Engine? It's a game engine, so. Right? It's just
bizarre. A lot of that Unreal is used for a lot of that kind of thing. They use it for doing previs of visual effects and animated stuff, also to enormous effect now as well, because they can iterate on it so fast and they can create these kind of environments to live in. So yeah, it's I don't know what's going to happen with film, because I think without theaters, a lot of the kind of paradigm of film suddenly flies up in the air. And another good case study of this is, look at The Queen's Gambit on Netflix, where here you have, it's not really a show, it's like a mini series. It's an 8-episode or 10-episode, I can't remember which, but a short run. It's essentially a long movie. It's like a 10-hour movie. And it broke every Netflix record they've ever had. I mean, it had like 70 million people watch it. And so there's people looking at that and going, why are we, with streaming models, why are we enshrining the 2-hour format? That was always, Hitchcock's famous quote was, a film's length is based around the capacity of the human bladder.
I've heard that.
And so without theaters to kind of enforce that, where 3.5 hours is like the absolute high mark. And even then there's all these wonderful entrepreneurial responses. One of my favorites is when Avengers Endgame came out, and it was literally like 3.5 hours. And someone told me about, there's an app where it's essentially like a piss break app that will tell you, like, now's the moment, here's the moment you should go if you're going to go, and we'll tell you on your phone like what you're missing while you're gone, which is hilarious. I was like, what a kind of brilliant idea. But there's essentially, when you overnight eliminate the need for any of that kind of thing, and now suddenly it's like the main format for film is actually what we previously called television, except the normal paradigms of television are no longer a given either, because maybe it's 8 hours.
Yeah.
Maybe it's 3 hours. Yeah. Maybe like I'm working on a documentary right now that literally started as a normal feature-length documentary. They were editing for like a year and change, and they had so much footage, and it was so powerful. And this is even before COVID. They looked around and said, well, actually, I guess COVID may have been one of the catalysts now that I rethink the timeline in my head. But at some point during the year, they looked at their footage and they said, we're bending over backwards to figure out how to make this really powerful thing into like 2 hours or less. But why? If it's going to end up on Netflix in the end anyway, like, why not just abandon our aim of a theatrical release and just make a 3-episode, 1 hour each sort of mini show? Because their footage is so powerful, it justifies that length. But it's really hard to get that down into 2 hours. And the audiences are showing up for it. That's the thing. So it's like, I think that there's this, the rattling of the skeleton was already happening, like an old steamship where you can hear or if you've ever lived in like an old apartment building where the pipes moan every time hot water passes through them. We were already witnessing that with the film industry in many regards, especially as the stratification had happened, where the only films that were making a lot of money were the $500 million gargantuan epics. And then there was no middle ground. There were no like $40 million films the way there used to be. And then there's just a giant pile of micro budget indies, 99% of which are never seen by anybody because it's just so hard. So you're ending up with this very, very sort of disproportionate production spend situation going on that's not really sustainable. I suspect. I'm no film economist, but it's just struck me as a model of, if the only movies being made are these mega franchise tentpoles that are dependent on 3,000 theater openings and like $200 million opening weekends, they're always in this perpetual arms race of, can this be the biggest opening weekend ever? And can this be the biggest opening weekend ever? So Netflix and Hulu and Disney Plus and HBO Max, and they've all thrown all that for a tailspin, such that I think, whereas TV used to be, like when I was getting into the business, TV was considered like, you go to TV, to pay your mortgage, but even then it was not much of a stepping stone, because film people thought TV people are not the real deal. Like, so most composers, you could be perfect example in the 90s, biggest TV composer in the freaking world was Mark Snow, with like many Emmys and the X-Files, of course, but also many other things. The only movies he could ever get hired on was the freaking X-Files movies. He was just not taken seriously. And that has started to change pretty dramatically. And what's more, the opposite has started to happen more and more, where you see so-called big film people going, I kind of want a TV show. And like look at the move of Ramin Djawadi going from Iron Man to Game of Thrones, and that's actually a step up. If you look at his, I don't think anybody would disagree with that. And so I see that happening more and more. Makes me wonder, what's the future of film? How games relate to all of that? It's hard to say. I suspect games are only going to continue to just exponentially grow.
Yeah, undoubtedly. So what do you think that means for someone, I don't know, in their early 20s who's trying to make some decisions about basically what they should say yes to and what they should say no to? One of the conversations I have a lot with composers is this idea of exclusivity and whether or not it's a good decision for them. Meaning, should I only become a game composer? Should I only become a film composer, TV? And what that trade-off might look like. And one of the cool things of this show is I've gotten to talk to people who are exclusively one of those things. And there's always a trade-off in how far you can go in a career based on you being known as the one person who does the one thing versus a jack of all trades. And you are someone who certainly has come from a lot of angles. And I like to think that you are one of the first pioneers of kind of the internet age. I don't know if you agree with that, but someone who...
Depends on what you mean. I don't think myself as a pioneer in any regard. But.
Well, I would consider you someone that's, we're in the same generation of people who grew up, who like went to a music school to pursue a career in this as a composer versus the older generation, which, more of an apprentice type deal where you knew somebody or you worked as an assistant. It's a very different model, and the internet's changed a lot. School programs have changed a lot. So I'd love any insight you can share on that of what advice would you give someone growing up in this crazy culture of there is no certainty in any of these fields. How would you guide someone through that?
Well, I think particularly the comment you made about the nature of exclusivity. I think that's in a way a personal call, because I that's of no interest to me, just because selfishly I love film, I love television, I love games, of course. I also love writing concert music. I love conducting, even chamber music, choral music, whatever. When opportunities come along, I get excited about those because I'm just fascinated by all the different things that we can do. And I love the kind of experimental, other things that exist in the broad. Like I did a sort of an interactive chamber piece for the Library of Congress last year, for example, where they wanted to commission a traditional concert work, and I basically countered with, what if we made it a piece where the audience gets to essentially direct the musicians in real time or in near real time, and so that and we can play the piece more than once on the program to demonstrate just how much power the audience actually has, for all intents and purposes, they will hear two different pieces. To me, the notion of saying, nope, you should only do one thing. I understand the reasoning behind it. I understand the idea that, if you live and breathe TV, for example, just all day, every day, your odds of ascending to higher levels of recognition and achievement in that area will surely only go up versus someone who's kind of doing it casually. And so I think that's, something well worth thinking about. And in that regard, it's no surprise probably that I do spend most of my time these days thinking about and sort of interacting with the game world. I spend most of my time in meetings, like the majority of my meetings are game developers, producers, publishers, that kind of thing. But you know, I also think, yeah, I have a whole spiel and tirade about my opposition to the conventional notion of networking, because I don't like the idea of talking with people with this overt subtext of how can you help me? How are you useful to me? And insofar as you are not, then I'm not really interested in this conversation. And I just am not. I don't like. I think that's a very horrible way to treat people. That's a very sort of unempathetic, inhuman way to treat fellow humans in a way. And so the reason I bring it up is because as you go from your early 20s to your late 20s and into your early 30s and onward, you just meet people, some of whom become your friends, and some subset of those people may be people that at some point a professional opportunity may develop from. And you connect, and something flourishes tomorrow, a year from now, 10 years from now. I got a call this week from a guy asking if I'd be interested in working on a game together, because we hung out and became friends and worked on a project together like 14 years ago, and have had only just occasional, like, hey, how's life? What's going on with you? Sort of interactions since. I've never sniffed around to see what he's up to and in what ways he could help me, or vice versa. We've just been friendly. And then when he found himself in a position to help production find a composer, he reached out to me, and we had a great catch up just on Skype 48 hours ago or whatever. And like, that's one of those where if you are out there meeting people like that, and one of those people happens to be a filmmaker, it's not that you are being bad at your exclusivity. If suddenly they're like, look, I know that you mostly do games, but you would be interested in scoring my film, like that to me, that's how my world has gone. Like I just to kind of summarize a meandering answer, I have focused a lot of energy because I found some opportunities that I could capitalize on in games, especially once Journey came out and it just exploded beyond any anticipated response. I realized, that there's momentum here that I would be stupid to ignore. And I love games. I mean, it's not even like that was a strategic decision. It's just when the phone started ringing, I was all too happy to take those calls because I love games. I mean, I play games practically every day and have since before I was even a musician. It's a very important medium to me. But as I just go about my life and meet people and organically develop relationships, if some of those people make film or some of those people make television, then, if they feel so inclined to bring me along on those adventures, then I would be, I'm all too happy to do so. So how people choose to focus their energies, that's entirely up to them. If it's one of those things that film scoring is just fundamentally uninteresting to you, then don't bother. There's nothing saying you have to do that.
That's a wonderful answer. And that just reminds me, I teach a lot this idea of pivoting and how we can't predict 10 years from now. We can't even predict next year. You never know what opportunities might come. And I feel like it's important to always be in a posture of yes. Doesn't mean you have to say yes to everything, but you should weigh that against what you actually love doing. And I think you and I are people that really do enjoy doing a lot of things. And there's something about the excitement of chasing something new.
Sure.
And this has been, for me, so I actually just turned 30 this year. And the more I talk to other composers who have passed 30, most of them say that right around that age, it's when you start questioning a lot because you've been doing something the same way for 10 years or whatever. And
that's pretty true.
It's a time that you start reflecting, okay, what do I really want to dig deeper into? And so this is just a conversation that I've been having a lot this year with people about putting, I think you said it well, that it's almost a pretty equal breakdown of the 80-20 principle of, what is 80% of my life really going to focus on that I love the most, but you kind of have that secondary thing that, okay, cool. If a film, I'm not going to chase it, but if a film comes along, if a TV show comes along, a podcast or any other number of media that kind of gets us out of the sameness, I think it's a cool way to leave yourself open for those opportunities instead of jumping down. No, I'll never do that. Because you're right. There's just, you never know. And a fun story, I'm not sure if you know this, but the game I'm working on right now I was talking about the phases of the orchestra earlier. That was a previous podcast client that I wrote for multiple shows.
Oh, no
all
kidding.
things. And he's like, yeah, we're ready to make a video game based on this story. And so we already had that relational equity. And we already had those years of working together to where it's just a natural extension because they want to bring their brand, their universe to other mediums too. So I think there's a lesson there that I think if you're open to it, but you're chasing something with definition, that it's a really cool way to make progress in your career. And I've certainly seen that. I've seen that for you as you've really gone hardcore with games, but I'm glad to hear that you're doing some other things too.
Yeah, I mean, the funny thing is that it'll probably, at the rate that things have been going, it will be still a handful of years before I have scored more games than films.
Really?
You just haven't heard of the films I've worked on, which I don't blame you. Like I said before, there's giant tentpoles and then a giant endless sea of smaller independent films. I remember back when I was heavily involved in the American Federation of Musicians sort of union politics back in around 2013, 2014. One of the big revelations that I had when I realized just how much the union was digging their own grave for like, just because it was so frustrating that they have some of these unbelievable superhuman musicians. And yet, unlike what you just said about sort of beginning from a posture of yes, like I always use stand-up comics improv comics with their yes and as their philosophy. Great improv always starts with I pitch you a thing, you just accept it and build on it. You never go, what? I don't know what you're talking about. It just kills improv immediately. And so I think entrepreneurship and just general sort of business acumen demands a kind of similar attitude. Those who are on their back heel playing a defensive game almost always end up eventually, if they don't die quickly, like a startup will often die quickly that way. But even like they always, people forget, they look at companies like there's always a big scare going on with companies like Facebook and Google and Amazon saying, oh, they're so big, they're so destructive because they're just impervious to, and I was like, 15 years ago, so was Yahoo, so was America Online. Like these were impossibly gigantic, just almost totalitarian companies. But at some point they shifted to a back heel defensive game and then they collapse. They eventually lose what it is that gave them that edge to begin with. And so I think when you approach business or life or creativity the same way, you eventually start to suffer for it because those things are sort of intrinsically about the curiosity. So anyway, the reason I brought up the union was because they have been playing that. That's in a way, that is their function. That's part of, in a way, I think what gives them a systemic challenge is because the whole notion of collective bargaining of labor with management means the whole leverage comes from, we can take away what you gain from us as, that is a negotiating strategy, like obviously epitomized by the notion of a strike. Well, the problem is that the union doesn't have that level of leverage that they think they do because it's so easy to just record elsewhere. And that's what's happened. So LA, when I first moved to LA, there were 5 scoring stages, Warner Brothers, Sony, and Fox, which are still around, and then 2 which have since been demolished, which was Paramount Stage M and at CBS Radford, Todd AO. And those 5 scoring stages, I remember when I first came here, I went down to the Musicians Union and I said, I'd like to go to a scoring session. They were like, sure, let's see what's going on. And they got out their little printout and all 5 stages were recording that day. And it was like an episode of Simpsons, an episode of Family Guy, and 3 big movies with like David Newman, Don Davis, and I can't remember, but it was like there was shit happening every day with like 90-piece orchestras. And now never mind COVID, say January 1st, 2020, it's a crapshoot on if there's a session happening on any given day. There's still a good amount of recording, especially because TV has seen an uptick, especially because of people like originally Michael Giacchino, but in recent years, people like Bear McCreary insisting on live ensembles. So, Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. did a full orchestra for every episode. And there have been some studios saying, okay, maybe we really should make budget for that. Star Trek Discovery, even as a streaming show, was recording with orchestra every episode. There is not nothing going on. But I remember saying to them, there's so much production happening. There are so many video games there because you're doing zero video games because of contractual issues. You're doing so little television. You're doing so little. Like there should be other ways. How reality TV is done. It's done through music libraries. You guys should have a better library contract so that you can be recording endless piles of music all day, every day, and be the musicians recording this music. And I was giving speeches and advocating and saying, you have the greatest recording studios and scoring crews and musicians. And they were on their back heel. And the big revelation for me was when I went and looked and saw how many feature films had been recorded under AFM contracts during that year, which was like 2013. And it was like 45 films had recorded in LA or New York, mostly LA. That year, the New York Times reviewed 900 films. And it made me realize, you guys you're losing. You're really badly. Look how many movies are being made. Now, of course, there are going to be all different budget ranges and all, but that's opportunity. That's not that's basically untilled fields. And so, yes, I have scored many of those films amongst the lost 900. I'm actually working on a feature right now. It's a UK production with a director. It's actually his first time directing, but he's an actor who was the star of a film that I scored like 15 years ago. And we've been friends ever since. And I think that's like my 55th or so feature film. And I've scored something in the neighborhood of 35 games. So it's, like I said, it's still going to be a while. I think I've definitely been scoring games at a faster rate than films in any given year. So at some point, theoretically, games will outpace film. But yeah, that's the thing. One game that people have heard of is worth more than 30 movies that no one's heard of.
You got that right. I want to shift gears for a minute. I want to know, what is your thought on branding? Personal branding, especially as someone who does multiple types of media, and knowing that moving forward, you're more or less, schedule-wise, is already dictated that you're doing more games than films. What does that look like? Obviously, you have bigger titles under your belt now, but how does it look now versus when you were 20 years old? You hadn't done Journey yet. What does that even look like?
I mean, it's interesting. I never thought about that kind of thing until, more or less there were folks paying attention. And so I don't know if it would have served me to think about that. It's kind of like, in a way, the agents discussion that always comes up of when should someone seek out or when is it valuable for them to have some sort of representation? And the conventional wisdom is basically wait for them to come to you. That's when you need them. If they are drawn to you, that means that you've achieved something that they feel they can capitalize on and help cultivate and grow. And most agents, especially good ones, if you haven't shown up on their radar, that means it's probably too early for you to try to put yourself on their radar. And I think branding is, in a way, for me at least, it functions similarly. I never really thought about that at all until suddenly I realized, I actually think more than my friends are reading my tweets or things like that. There was a real stark shift in 2012 when Journey came out, and I had done things that got out there. I had films in, Sundance. I had my first game, Flow, was kind of this indie darling, but Journey was just shattered all of that. I mean, the reaction was it's still surreal to me to this day. I mean, literally people write to me every day, almost without fail, that, oh, I just played Journey for the first time, or I just dusted it off for the first time, or I have people that, it's an annual tradition, and some people that play it like still every day. And
It's amazing.
It's just like, it's just anomalous thing. It's very baffling. So I did start to think more about, how do I represent myself? And I don't really think of it as branding. To the extent that it is, I like the idea that what I want to communicate to people is that my central MO is curiosity. I am not a musician or a composer defined by any one trope. Like, for example, using my friend Darren as the counterexample, the ultimate image of Darren is singing at a microphone with a guitar in his hand in front of like a PAX audience. That's basically like, that summarizes Darren amazingly effectively. He's very versatile as a musician. I mean, we collaborated on Darren's first stab at orchestral music, and he did a great job. Like, I thought he would need me more than he did. Because he said over and over, I don't know what I'm doing. I don't know what I'm doing. I don't know what I'm doing. And then he sent me his first draft. I was like, this is viable orchestral music, dude. So it's like, so it's not that he can't do that, but that's his home turf, his wheelhouse, his comfort zone. And he thrives in it. He writes amazing stuff in that domain. So to him, periodic videos and photos of him doing that, I think kind of reminds people remember that image brings to mind, oh yeah, Hades, Bastion, Transistor, Pyre, these are fantastic. That reminds me of, that wonderful experience at PAX, and, I should pick up that vinyl and and there's a lot there. But I've never felt comfortable with that. Even the only thing even close to that I have in terms of branding is like images of me conducting, because I do love concerts and I love connecting with people and I love trying to do fun experiments in that domain of live music. But even then, I'm not. I always hated the idea of being defined by that. For example, if someone sees me with a baton in my hand and they are thinking, I'm looking for something kind of bold and experimental electronic for a thing, they'll swipe right past the baton guy. But my real joy is going somewhere I've never been. So I always try to really broadcast that as much as possible, that like, and I don't deny that, I definitely have a perception as an orchestral composer, because it's wrapped into the majority of what I've done. But that's why I try to go way out of my way to really, first off, do it less in a way. I kind of marginalize the orchestra even on projects where I know they want orchestra. Pathless being an example where it moved very dramatically away from anything that you would traditionally identify as orchestral, and that was not driven by branding. That was just me being my sort of authentic self and saying, I'm curious to see what else is out there. I've done a lot of orchestral music. So that to me is what the branding is all about. That's partly why I've also been podcasting a lot more, and I've been building up my YouTube channel over the last year. Like about summer of 2019, I made this conscious choice, like, okay, I'm going to start pushing multiple videos per month on YouTube. I want, really high production value. And I want it to be about like exploring the art of music. Like it's my lens through exploring just the nature of creativity. So sometimes it's sort of video essays. I've started doing those where I talk about other people's music. And I say, this is why this blew me away. This made me a better composer by having been exposed to it. And then also just like a kind of demystification of my own work. I release videos of like, here's the full sheet music to this cue for everybody to see. And I add text commentary where I'm like, notice, the sheet music is a little different here than what you hear because we made edits for purposes of the album, or this was the loop point in the game, but the album you blow right past that. You don't even know that. And I leave little clues to explain like the process, because to me that's just, I don't know. That to me is all wrapped into this notion of curiosity. The idea of I want to always be learning more and going to new fields, new pastures, that sort of thing. So to the extent that I'm branded that way, how successful that is, it's hard to say. I don't know.
I talked with Rich Vreeland, Disaster Piece, earlier this year.
Yeah. He's amazing.
He had a very similar response to that, where he termed it his relationship to music is changing. And he talked about how like every 2 or 3 years he feels wildly different about who he is and as a composer or whatever, as a person, and how his projects have been all over the place. And even now he's even considering kind of stopping writing for a while because he's been doing it nonstop and wants to maybe teach. And it's just very curious how I feel like he very much an artist.
Yeah, he is a particularly good example. I remember when Fez came out, it's very tempting to go, I think I know who he is as a composer, because there's a hit. In the same way that for so many people, I am interchangeable with Journey's music forever, no matter what I do. And that means that Journey reached so many people that, it achieved a kind of critical mass, and that's a privilege. Like I don't shy away from feeling grateful about that, even though I know that no matter what I do, Journey will kind of eclipse everything, pending something being somehow an even bigger hit, which is possible, but I don't count on it. I just grateful to still have opportunities to put food on the table. So it was tempting when Fez came out to come to a similar conclusion about Rich and say, okay, he's kind of a chiptune-y sort of that hipster retrograde composer. And then Hyperlight Drifter came out, and I was like, this is a whole other beat. There's an explorer here. I remember being blown away and I didn't love that game as much as I wanted to. I just had a hard time connecting with it aesthetically. And it wasn't anyone's fault. It's just the way it added up just didn't quite square with my taste, even though I could recognize how clever it was. And the people that made it are friends of mine whose talent I admire. But Rich's score I found so captivating. And then it's like, flash forward another year, and I'm happy. And and it was the film on the heels of that. It Follows was closer to the expectation of the Fez guy doing a horror film. That math squares a little. It's reductive, obviously, but it's like that's not a big leap. But I remember I was having lunch with a friend of mine who's a conductor and orchestrator. He's a composer as well, but he earns his living principally as an orchestrator and conductor. And he messages me, or we are having lunch, and I'm asking him, what are you up to? What have you been doing? And he said, I just finished a bunch of conducting on a recording session for a film called Under the Silver Lake. And I was like, that's Rich Vreeland. And he was like, yeah, it was really good writing. And I went and listened to it, and it was almost this Bernard Herrmann-esque sort of, and totally orchestral, kind of chamber orchestral. And it was the real deal. And I remember I was like, in a way, the unexpected is now exactly what I expect from him. And I absolutely adore that. I mean, every time he and I have hung out, I always think I should make a point to hang out with him more, because he's just such a good and insightful guy. But his writing, and his career trajectory, I find genuinely inspiring for the same reason. He's always kind of reinventing, and he doesn't feel this need to kind of be the Fez guy in anything that he's doing. And I try to be the same way.
I just consider that the artist personality, which is funny because I'm more of a business personality who happens to be an artist. So I almost always approach from this angle of branding and marketing and strategy, but then I do the art within the confines of that. But I think it's all healthy. It's just a different personality.
I think in a way it's a piece of collective hive mind branding that artists have managed to convince the world that they're not like that. That artists are the Beethoven, Beethoven who was born 250 years ago tomorrow. The tortured genius who can't be bothered with such human mundanities as balancing a checkbook and thinking in terms of branding and all that. Probably to some extent it's true because it was a different world back then, but also entrepreneurial artists is not a new thing. In before Beethoven's time, in the 18th century, the little catchphrase, when you look and see that, one of Bach's many sons found success as a composer in England, despite being a German composer, the wisdom of the day was you go to Italy to learn and London to earn. And there were, despite the fact that German composers dominated the kind of zeitgeist of what was going on in Western Europe, the majority of them were all being, and ironically, British composers between Purcell in the 1600s and then the kind of renaissance of composers in the early 20th century, like obviously Holst and Vaughan Williams and William Walton and Benjamin Britten, and there's this 400-year gap of acclaimed British composers, but yet that's where they went to earn the money. It's just an odd thing that somehow it didn't spark more of their own talent to really achieve that level. But the German composers were doing phenomenal business in London for literally centuries. So the idea that composers were not sort of looking around for creative opportunities. I mean, Brahms is another example I love. Brahms was one of the few composers that was quite famous without really ever working on commission. He basically wrote music of his own accord, and then people would fight for the right to premiere it. And then it would just make its way into the world because he was so broadly celebrated by the intelligentsia of the music scene. But the thing that made him well known was his symphonies and his piano music. But those are more corollary than people realize, because the majority of people celebrated and knew his symphonies from the piano reductions that he'd made so that it was performable by normal people. So he was selling sheet music by the truckload of his piano reductions of his symphonies because only the aristocracy could go to orchestra concerts. But in the early days of the Industrial Revolution, the average person owned a piano in higher and higher sort of proportions. And so he made a very, by those standards, he made a killing selling piano music of his symphonies. So it's like this idea that someone like Hans Zimmer, who's an incredibly shrewd businessman, is actually this total anomaly. I mean, another famous example that I love is George Gershwin, who was perpetually dissatisfied by his own technique as a composer, and yet this clear, just outrageous genius. But yet he felt like, I don't have comfort, I don't have command over particularly the orchestra. And so he famously went to Stravinsky and said, will you teach me? Stravinsky, in the wake of the Russian ballets in Paris, was a internationally known, and not celebrity in the truest sense, but every composer on the planet knew Stravinsky. So Gershwin goes to him and says, I'd like to learn from you, maestro. Gershwin, composer of many hit songs by that point, Tin Pan Alley kind of stuff. Stravinsky says, Mr. Gershwin, how much money did you make last year? Gershwin says, $200,000 or something. And bear in mind, this is 100 years ago. And Stravinsky says, I think I should be the one taking lessons from you, sir. There's always been an admiration for those that find ways to succeed and to succeed well. It's because there's a million unemployed geniuses, it's not enough. So anyway, I'm sure I didn't even give you a chance to ask your question. I think that, especially for anybody listening that's at those early days and feeling kind of at crossroads, I've always felt that the business side of it and the creative side of it are not actually independent sides. That, like when people say, should we talk to your agent about the contract, or like we don't want to muddy the creative waters. I say, look, that is my agent's, in the same way that like I work with a mixer and they mix my music, but I'm there over their shoulder every step of the way. We're talking about it. I reach forward on the faders periodically and make adjustments myself. I have the same dynamic with my agent. She specializes in this. She speaks that language more fluently than I do, but we are partners. And to me, the creative conversation is informed by the business conversation and vice versa. There have been projects where I said, you really need, Banner Saga is my favorite example of this. They had this middle of the road budget where I was like, we can afford a big orchestra and I get paid nothing, or I can get paid pretty well and it has to all be in the box or like very cheaply done. But the game really called for a bold sound. So I went to them and I said, look, I really want to give you, I'm willing to roll the dice on you guys if you're willing to cut me in on the game. And so we worked out a deal where I basically was like, I'm not going to take any money for 2 years on this project. I'm going to put everything into the production on the gamble that I think this game's going to do well. And it did. And so I ended up financially being set, but I was fine. It was a good deal. I did okay. And we got to record, fully. And it was just sounded like $1 million. And it was one of those where the business and the creative were very interwoven. They're not really separate conversations. How you determine a budget is in part by the kind of music you want to write, but the kind of music you want to write is also informed by knowing what you can afford. So it becomes a chicken and egg kind of conversation. And to me, the idea of saying, oh, no, I'm not going to think about these businessy conversations. You are best case scenario selling, like closing doors for yourself as a composer. You might be actually actively sabotaging your career without knowing it. Anyway, you were going to ask something along that wavelength though, and I kind of usurped your station. I apologize.
No worries. That was really good insight. Oh, this is still a question in that vein. What have you personally changed your mind about in the last few years, either in career or creatively, knowing that you are someone that changes often? We all change, obviously, but maybe in that vein of business.
Yeah, this is a very small example, but it's the first thing that sprang to mind. I grew up a big record collector. I have thousands of particularly soundtrack albums on CD, and there are a few record labels that you come to really admire as a result of that, as like they always have the best stuff and they produce it so lavishly and they really understand and they care, and the kind of apex of that was always Varese Sarabande, this the Bob Townsend, who had been there for many decades, personally produced like 1,500 albums, and so it was like, that was one of those things of when I first got started, it was like, that's one of those little check marks of, I really one day want to release an album on that label. I want to see my score with that signature red and white spine that they put on the album. And at some point I realized, I think that labels are kind of superfluous to the modern business model. Like, they used to be a necessary gatekeeper because the means of distribution were complex. But some businesses like CD Baby, TuneCore, DistroKid have come along and said, we can just make this as easy as the click of a few buttons and type in some info and you're good. And I realized, why would I forfeit control over a thing that I can do better? I can directly communicate to my, people that are interested in me on Twitter and on Instagram and whatever. I can talk directly to them. I have a Discord server. I can do all these things where I can just interact, because I love that. I love talking to people. I love sharing life basically. And I thought, the traditional machinations for distribution are uninteresting to me, and I was very lucky. I got that. I had two albums come out on Varese. I got to have the kind of or three actually, two games and a film. The film was called The Rendezvous. It was a big old-fashioned orchestral score that we did at the Colorado Symphony. The movie got absolutely no notice. It was a small independent film, but we went all in on the score, and it's like a big old-fashioned, almost like an 80s adventure kind of score and film. They put that out, and then they put out a game called Tooth and Tail on vinyl and CD, and they also did a CD only of Abzu. And so Abzu was interesting because it was basically 3 record labels involved, because the one area where I don't quite feel this way is with regard to vinyls, because the massive pain in the ass of manufacturing and fulfillment. I've done it, I've tried it, and it's such a pain in the ass to deal with. Unless you're ready to have a staff for this, which for my little boutique needs is quite unnecessary. The biggest that I've undertaken personally was a 1,000 disc run that we sold out of the Journey piano album. But all the other vinyls, all the vinyls that I've done, I've worked with record label partners, and then I'll do limited runs of signed ones that I'll sell myself through my label. But otherwise, for digital, that's where I'm at. And CDs, we could do CDs. I just don't do them anymore because, again, that's another one. I always loved physical media, but at some point I was like, there's no one. My car doesn't have a CD player. My computer doesn't have a CD player. Like, why? Just because we liked it as kids doesn't mean we should keep doing it. So that's definitely an area. Another example that I could bring up that's maybe a little bit closer to home for this was for the first probably 5 or 6 years of my career. That when I very first was given an opportunity to demo on a project, I was like, oh, hell yeah, jumped straight in, wrote a demo, few early ones. I got the job. So awesome. My career started to have, a little bit of a leg to stand on. And then at some point when I would be asked to demo, as I fell in love with experimenting, and I really was trying to push myself somewhere new with every single film and game and everything, I realized the iterative process with the director, be it the game director or the film director, was such that the first thing we tried was almost never the thing we went with. So I started to develop a real aversion to demos. And I would try to explain to them, look, I need you to basically just trust me, because where we end up is something that a demo will never reflect. The demo, so I started to regard demos as I'm making it easy for them to not hire me, because I basically have 2 choices. I write a demo reflective of what I actually think we should do, which is gonna probably feel like it's coming out of left field, and they're gonna go, no, like that's not what I want. Whereas if they just hired me and we got there incrementally together as a collaboration, then they would love it by the end. That was calculation number 1. Calculation number 2 was, or I write something that makes me want to slit my wrists, where it's like very safe and very generic and not taking any risks. And it's basically a demo to try to get hired as opposed to a demo to serve their project, which are 2 different things. It's kind of like in school. Do you memorize to ace the test, or do you actually learn the material irrespective of the test? And so I started to try to talk people out of making me demo, because I just thought demos are toxic. Demos are giving them more reasons to not hire me than to hire me, whereas I think I can convince them to hire me. And at some point I realized that is actually a very stupid mentality. And my biggest revelation was, I don't know, maybe 5, 6 years ago, saying, actually demos are an opportunity. And if I pitch something really weird, and not everything needs like super bold, weird experimental approach. It's not like that's all that I am interested in. sometimes the beauty of it is actually like, we should just go very old fashioned with this, very traditional. But setting that aside, it's the first opportunity to see just how much we click. And part of the change for me was one time I wrote a demo where I resisted, and then they said, look, if you want the job, you're going to have to. There's a few other people that have already written demos, so it's like shit or get off the pot. So I decided, okay, screw it. I'm not going to get this job anyway, so I'm just going to write something crazy. And so I wrote a demo that I thought, they're never going to like this. It's too weird. And I get a call, and the director goes, I don't like this. It's too weird. But it shows to me that you're the right person for the job, because someone willing to do this kind of thing is what I'm looking for. So this experiment was a failure, but the fact that you did the experiment is why I want to hire you for this film. It ended up being one of my favorite films I've ever worked on, and a few friendships came out of that are people I will cling to for the rest of my life, regardless of if we work together again. I mean, it was one of those. So, and it made me realize demoing is a chance to say, here's who I am. And it's totally okay if you're not into that. It's really okay. But I want to authentically represent myself. And so I shouldn't be playing. It's the same thing we talked about at the beginning or earlier. If I'm going into this playing a defensive game, I'm not thinking of it the right way. That's not what opportunity is about. Opportunity is all about leaning forward. It's an aggressive game. It's leaning in, not posturing back on your heel to stabilize against a blow. So at some point I said, you know what, screw it. I will demo with reckless abandon. And I very quickly piled up a huge list of demos for jobs that I didn't get. But the ones that I got, it was like we hit the ground running. And I thought, you know what? It doesn't take away that it's disappointing to not get a job. I did so many demos for things I was, because I was aggressive. I was telling my agent, like, let's go after things that they're probably not going to pay attention to me, but I don't mind. I was actually very close to landing Star Trek Discovery this way, because I just started hurling demos at CBS, and it almost worked. I mean, it was like it came down to me and a couple other people at the very end after a year of 3 different rounds of demos, all of which were, I was going out of pocket on big orchestra recordings and really showcasing, like, this is what I think I can bring to your show. And I felt like I represented myself. I said, this is my love of Star Trek and me in one piece of music, that if you're not into it, that is your prerogative. And the only thing that I'm always want to be careful about is to make sure that it doesn't sound like I'm not interested in collaboration, because I'm actually driven by collaboration. It's my single favorite aspect of working in these medium. Otherwise, I would just write symphonies and operas. Like, to me, the collaboration is the selling point of film and games. The directors and the filmmakers and whatever, they take you places you would not go on your own. They give you feedback and give you suggestions that make you step outside of yourself. And as a creative person who's always trying to explore, that's like a drug. To me, it's just absolutely amazing. I love it to death. So I don't want it to say that here's me, take it or leave it, as if I'm not interested in inviting them into the process. But there's a recognition that comes later. The demo is them saying, show me what you got. Here's our material. What do you make of it? And I give them honest answers. At some point I realized I would rather give them an honest answer, even if I think this is probably taking the odds of me getting this job down to 10%. Because I don't want to play it safe. I want to show them a version of their thing they haven't seen before. And some of them are going to get real excited. Now, this is obviously, I'm overgeneralizing. It's case by case. Sometimes, like I remember a demo opportunity came up for a Star Wars project, and they basically were like, this needs to be very John Williams. Just, we're telling you up front. So I was like, I'm not actually interested in that. So I didn't demo. That was one where I said, I don't. It's hard for me to resist the instincts to try this, try that, try this. And the Williams thing is so specific that you deviate from it by 1 degree and it just doesn't work anymore. There's a lot of people that have tried to imitate him and failed because they are 99% of the way there. And his sound is so technically specific, like the technique of his voicings and his melody, and like someone like Gordy Habb has cracked that code so amazingly.
That's exactly who I was thinking of. The only person I can think of that has actually achieved that.
Yeah, I agree. I completely agree. And even amongst, you know, the Giacchinos and Joel McNeelys of the world who have done high-profile Star Wars projects, to me, Gordy just does a far better job. He does something that I don't think I could have done. I believe I could hopefully have gotten there in purely musical terms, but the act of writing, those hours you spend alone, at some point I would have thought, you know, it's just so tempting to say, you know, it would be interesting here if, you know, what if the tuba was actually up above and I start like, and now it's not Williams anymore, and I've broken the commandment of what I was supposed to do, and so if nothing else, I admire his discipline. I actually, funny enough, I like his writing more than I like Williams' own writing lately. Like, I think that Star Wars Battlefront and Star Wars Jedi Fallen Order are better Star Wars scores than The Force Awakens, The Last Jedi, or Rise of Skywalker. I think they remind me more of Williams in the 80s. When, you know, Empire Strikes Back, particularly, when you listen to that score, he sounded like he was willing to die after every cue. Meaning, like, this cue could be my epitaph. He left nothing on the table. It's just, it sounds like he poured every inch of his soul. And it felt like creative inspiration firing on all cylinders in a way that few people ever achieve. Now, what I hear is a composer who has nearly unmatched technique, who is basically going through the motions and not hearing the whispering of the muses the way he once was. Perhaps because it's just not exciting to him, perhaps because they no longer whisper to him for whatever reason. And that's not to say that there aren't glimmering moments in those scores where I'm like, that's why he's John Williams and why that name means something, because there are these flashes of fantastic of brilliance in the vein of his earlier years, even relatively recent years, as recently as 10 and 15 years ago. You know, Prisoner of Azkaban, Memoirs of a Geisha, those scores to me go toe to toe with anything he's ever written. They're phenomenal. But at some point, especially with Star Wars, it kind of feels like, you know, I've done this. I've written like 20 hours of music for the last 40 years for this thing. I kind of feel like it's a formula, so I don't begrudge him. Whereas meanwhile, Gordy is more like the age John Williams was when he was first starting Star Wars, and he wants to leave nothing on the table, and I can feel that. So I'm like, if I had a choice, I'd pick Gordy at this stage. You know, like I think and that's with the absolute most esteemed respect to John Williams that I could ever possibly have. I mean, to me, he is a legend, if ever that word means anything, and it's so overused. But he really is. He's one of only a couple, maybe the only composer to have specialized in film that I think will be truly immortal because of it. His music so transcends the films. People will care about his music long after film means anything to anybody. So anyway, it's a big tangent, but yes, I think I got there somehow through the subject of demoing, because demoing is something that now I happily, I don't consider myself above any demo opportunity. And to be clear, it wasn't that I ever thought I was above it. It's that I was afraid of it. That's all it boils down to. I got myself into a position of thinking, oh, I want this job and I'm afraid I might lose it. And it's like, if you see as a straight person, if I see a beautiful woman and I'm not single, but if I were single, if I saw a beautiful woman and thought how amazing it would be to go on a date with this person, I can imagine how exciting that would be, and I let the fear of her rejecting me overcome that, then I have nothing. I've achieved nothing. And I see projects the same way. The fear of rejection becomes so overwhelming that we're like, no, demoing is a bad idea. And I was like, the weird thing was, it was having tasted a little bit of career success, that gave me that fear. It is like, no, I have a thing now and I don't want to lose that thing. Whereas before I had nothing. So it was like, please, all the demo opportunities, I'll take them all, because it was, I had nothing to lose. And at some point I realized I should, that's a much better attitude. I should embrace. So yeah, I have an album that you can find on Spotify called Remnants. That's literally an hour and a half of rejected music. And yeah, not all of it is demos. There's a few in there of scores I was fired from. And there's also a couple in there of projects that were canceled where it wasn't that I was fired, it's just that it died. So, but the overwhelming majority of that album, it's like, probably 75 out of the 90 minutes are demos for things I didn't get hired for. And I don't have a single regret on that album. There's a couple, I do have a few there are a few demos in the world so there have been a few opportunities that I've had that it was heartbreaking. I was really excited. There's a couple that still keep me up at night where I'm like, damn, that was such, there's one in particular where in part they kind of insinuated that I had the job. And I think that they overextended that on their end. They kind of let me believe it more than they ought to have. But I also recognize the extenuating circumstances that I later found out about on their end, so I kind of don't blame them for that. But it was one of those where the project was so fantastic. It's going to be years before it ever surfaces. It was one of those probably 5-year, like very long-term thing. So, it'll be ages before it ever reappears. But there's a few of those where I'm like, but that's where I'm like, okay, so it turns out I'm actually human and I care about these things and I get excited, and I would rather be the guy that's occasionally heartbroken than the more clinical type. It's no different than relationships. It's like if you're so afraid of being heartbroken, the solution to that will inevitably be then stay alone. But there's real drawbacks to always being alone, I think, at least for me as an intrinsically social person. So yeah, in any case, I know I kind of gave you some very meandering and sort of specific things, but I definitely, there's a lot that's evolved. Those are just the first things that have come to mind.
Yeah. Well, Austin, thank you so very much. And I know that we went over here today, but I do appreciate just being transparent. That's all I could ever ask. Not holding anything back and just being real. Those are the best conversations that are actually helpful. And I know that we're always learning and growing. So this is a lot of great content that I know that we'll all want to listen to multiple times, because there's a lot of cool little key bits that I think you've learned, because you're not new at this. You've been doing it a while, and I think we learn as we go.
Yeah, it's my pleasure, man. It's everything you say kind of triggers thoughts, but I'm happy to leave it there. I'm grateful that you asked me to come on here. I appreciate your tenacity also with getting it on the calendar. I know I was kind of distracted when you first reached out about it. So
yeah, and I appreciate you, man. It just means we got to talk again more.
Happy to do it.
Continue the conversation. But hey, I wish you a very Merry Christmas, Happy Holidays.
Hopefully, if we are truly the swan song of everybody's least favorite year, hopefully
and some hope, right?
we offer a glimmer of positivity for 2021 and beyond.
Yes, for real. All right, man. Well, I hope you have a good one. Look forward to chatting next time.
Absolutely, man. Take care.